There is this glaring gap in our history from the end of the Vietnam War up through the Persian Gulf War. How did we get from the roof of the embassy in Saigon in 1975 to the streets of New York in 1991, celebrating victory? It truly is a missing chapter because it explains so much about who we are as Americans today and where our military is today and how we got there. And that's really the story that people need to know.
We left Vietnam with our tail between our legs. We lost a war. We failed. Vietnam fell.
For me, the biggest lesson of Vietnam is don't go to war if the people of the country don't support what you're doing.
When you look at the period immediately after the war, early 70s, I think our military was in trouble. We went from a populace that the major part of it was anti-war, but then they allowed it to go anti-military. So now every time a Vietnam vet walks through an airport and sees a young soldier, sailor, airman, Marine who's somebody shaking their hands or standing up and clapping or saying thank you for your service or you could have my first class seat and all, that's something that Vietnam vet never had.
When I went to Southeast Asia, they told us to take our uniforms off to travel. Because if you walked through the airport in San Francisco, you would get accosted.
The Army was broken when we finished in Vietnam. Nobody was trained well. We weren't training particularly well. We didn't really have standards. We had morale problems. The Army was broken.
In the early 70s, we had civil unrest in our country.
Racial unrest, heavy drug use. I mean, we're a reflection of what society is. Those issues were certainly rampant in the United States, so it was natural it was going to wash over into the military. The degree of violence and unrest, lack of discipline, really challenged leaders.
As a lieutenant, when I was signed to be officer of the day, you had to be armed with a .45. And it wasn't unusual to have 5 or 6 incidents a day in your unit.
As a young 18, 19-year-old, I was really frustrated with the way that played itself out.
It's not what I envisioned. I envisioned something more professional, more aimed at training and doing things, and this didn't appear to be it.
Could we ever resolve these issues? Will we ever get back to the force that we had before? Can we meet the challenges going forward of the kind of force we want to build? I think it was a credit to our leadership at that time to make the decision, and this was the term that was going around, we're going to get our head out of the jungle. We have other global commitments. It had to be a major transformation. By the time the late 70s came around, you could see the transformation occurring in a number of areas.
The quality of the soldiers, they were all draftees. And I had some who were motivated, but I had a lot who were just playing out the string. Been to Vietnam, I've come back, I've got 5 months before I'm out of here, and so I'll do the least that I have to do.
That was the start, if you will, of the move from a draft army to an all-volunteer army.
By 1973, there were no more draftees, and all of my young enlisted soldiers were volunteers.
Don't get me wrong, the draftee army was tough, but quality-wise, the all-volunteer army, head and shoulders above.
Those individuals who came to me while I was on recruiting duty are there because they wanted to be there. There was something that they saw that they wanted that to be a part of their life.
What that allowed the Army to do was to set very high standards for the recruits that we brought in.
You couldn't just walk up and say, well, I've got a felony conviction, but can I be in the Army? And in Vietnam, the answer to that may well have been, yes, just get out of here. But by the mid-70s, the answer was no. You can't. You have to meet these standards.
So you saw a different educational level, a different level of maturity. You also saw a more diverse group. When I entered the military, less than 5% of the service had women in it. And now there's about 15%.
All the services had to make a decision that they were willing to reduced some of the barriers that had previously existed to women serving more broadly in the military. So I was very proud.
And of course, it was those who wanted to be there and wanted to serve that grew into the leaders of, the 80s and the 90s, and they continue to serve. The non-commissioned officer education system made huge improvements as far as what we were able to give to first, second tier leaders.
We had a basic non-commissioned officer course, then the advanced non-commissioned officers course, the first sergeant's course, and on up the line, all the way to the senior sergeants, the sergeants major in units in the Army, and they were superb.
We created the Marine Corps University. We upgraded our education and training system. The professional military education system became more structured. The other services did the same.
The Navy took a really hard look at what are we doing wrong? And they started some very realistic, very hard, very disciplined, very self-critical training, and that was the birth of Top Gun. So Top Gun came out of public failure, if you will.
You had the Combat Maneuver Training Center in Europe. You had the National Training Center at Fort Ord, California. You had the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And folks would prepare for the fight before they went to the fight.
It was a significant change in the way we were thinking and the way we were valuing education and training, the way we were holding leadership accountable. This was a sort of a whole new world.
And then suddenly Reagan's president, and it's morning in America again, and we're investing in our military.
We were also able to finally move beyond equipment that was woefully out of date in many cases.
When Reagan got elected, he immediately went on a big buildup of the military, and it helped us immensely.
The early 80s were a time of modernization of the Army like probably hasn't happened since then.
The 80s was the birthplace and development of the M1 tank.
Named Abrams after General Creighton Abrams, great armor leader of World War II in Vietnam and subsequently Chief of Staff of the Army.
Everybody from everywhere came to see the very first XM1 tank off the production line. It was XM1. I'm saying XM1 because it wasn't an M1 tank then. It was experimental. We had some great equipment before, but this was something else.
I was very fortunate that I was one of the first 6 instructors on the M1. The M60 series had a relatively good fire control system, but it didn't have the mobility. And the M1, what it brought was great firepower and, of course, tank accuracy and speed.
The M1 tank would move across country at 40 or 45 miles an hour. The M60 tank, probably 20 on a good day. Thermal sights, stabilized gun system so you could shoot while it was moving. It was just an incredible piece of equipment to move forward.
We were dealing not just with an excellent new tank with a jet turbine engine, but we were also filling those tank crews with some excellent soldiers.
The M1 tank certainly was key critical to the warfight, but you had the Bradley fighting vehicle, which was a complement. You had the Apache helicopter, a quantum leap, if you will, over the Cobra or the UH-1.
We're putting the Black Hawk helicopter, the SINGARS radios, GPS. It was a revolutionary change in the force.
In the 80s, we had the advent of planes like the A-10 Warthog, which was a ground attack aircraft. Planes like the F-15, we had both a strike version to hit ground targets, and we had an air-to-air version.
The things that came about, they were developing in the 80s, and they really came about. One was pulse Doppler radars. F-15 brought them about predominantly, and that gave us ability to what was called look down, shoot down in the front hemisphere. Radar technology improved in the airplane. It also improved in the missile, heat-seeking missile, the Sidewinder, the AIM-9. So now, not only could you see them on your radar, but you could hit them with a missile in the front hemisphere. The air-to-ground side radar also got better significantly, so you could do what's called ground mapping, the capability of the radar where you could actually paint things on the ground using your radar.
2 types of submarines. The hunter-killer attack submarine, first one I was on called the William H. Bates, and then our missile submarines. At that time, 41 of them. We're pretty much out of anything that's a diesel submarine. The old days of World War II are over. Everything is nuclear.
Between stealth and the use of satellites, more global positioning satellite, based operations, it was just a huge influx of a lot more technology.
The development of those weapons were the backbone of being able to build a force that was trained and qualified.
And so we were now building up a degree of confidence in our ability to handle missions should they go hot in some respects in Europe or in the Pacific or elsewhere.
Really, 10 years removed from Vietnam, we're kind of feeling like we're back. And yet we had tests, things happening that our military had to respond to in the 1980s. I remember when I was young, in 1983, picking up the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and it showed the bombing of the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut. Over 200 Marines killed in this bombing.
When they blew up the barracks, we were probably 2 or 3 miles away. We heard it. It woke us up in the morning, and we weren't quite sure what had happened.
It was the result of a truck bomb being driven into the front entrance of the Marine Corps barracks. It was my first introduction to this concept of terrorism.
I remember seeing one of my Marine Corps friends crying because several of his Marines had been killed. It was his old outfit. And I remember the anger. You know, how do we get back at these guys? How do we get these guys? Pretty intense.
We were beginning to see the threat of terrorism rise, the need to conduct certain operations like non-combatant evacuation operations, raids, and other things. So one thing that came out of that was positive is rethinking strategic deployments, strategic positioning, and strategic objectives when we take on these sorts of missions.
2 days after that happens, the United States invaded a small Caribbean island called Grenada, and the U.S. military was sent in to alleviate the threat of the government turmoil there and the potential of trapped Americans on the island. That test was passed, but it showed a number of shortcomings.
There wasn't significant enemy force or resistance, but what we learned from that was problems of operating jointly really came out in that operation.
We found that there were units in the Army whose radio frequency band didn't allow them to make radio contact with the Marine unit operating on their right flank.
Why does somebody have to call for naval gunfire on a commercial telephone? That's not a good idea. And so one of the things that I did see grow out of Grenada was more inter-service communication and planning.
When we began to put the pieces together, we realized we're better when we're working together and marrying those different capabilities that each one brings to the fight. So it was huge. We now began to think jointly. We trained jointly. We had the Joint Chiefs of Staff now took over a lot of the day-to-day running of military operations.
We tried to learn from each of these experiences so that by the time U.S. forces were engaged in 1989 in Panama, we had come a long way.
The invasion of Panama and Operation Just Cause was the removal of Manuel Noriega from power based on charges of drug trafficking and other things. The invasion of Panama showed the new U.S. military on full display and a rapid victory with relatively low casualties. There is no doubt that dictators like Manuel Noriega and others were put on notice by what happened in Just Cause. The U.S. military, if it wants to, can remove you from power.
The fact that they were able to do those missions and accomplish them successfully with minor losses was an effect of the standard of training that we had across the force.
Every conflict was different, but we felt that we had a lot of lessons learned because there are different wars that you fight different ways. You know, we were motivated, we were enthusiastic that we were successful, and it showed the people that we could go to war.
When we got back to Europe in the 80s, the Soviet Union was by now, if not a peer, a near-peer adversary. And the Cold War was, I think it would be fair to say, was at its height.
Stateside units constantly rotated into Europe. Europe was the fight. It was the Fulda Gap, which was the inner German border. When there was two Germanys, East Germany and West Germany, and that was going to be where the Soviet hordes were going to come through with their Warsaw Pact.
I was the lieutenant on the road in the Fulda Gap. No one told me I was the tripwire for the thing, but I was.
If the Russians invade or the East Germans invade, this is where you're going. And this is the plan you're going to use to fight them. And so you could take your company out on the ground and you could say, this is your position. And they're going to come through here. When that tank comes over that rise, you take 2 shots and then come with me. I'll show you where you move next. Having a major adversary right across the border from you, locked and loaded with plans to come and roll right through you, is a real motivator. 60 miles from the front line was my wife and kids. And so that was a concern.
We really believed that the way to stop them was going to be air power, to buy time to allow the rest of the U.S. forces and the NATO forces to be ready to go. So you did a 24-hour tour on alert. I was a young lieutenant, and you're in the airplane and you're tense, and you don't know what's going to happen next.
American units in Fort Irwin, California, in the National Training Center, would travel there and spend a month in the desert fighting what was probably the best Soviet motorized rifle regiment on the planet in the early 1980s, and all of them were Americans to use Soviet-style tactics, Soviet techniques, because that's the most dangerous force that we faced.
We started a program that was later declassified. It was very classified at the time, that I ended up becoming a part of, which was called Constant Peg. And we had some Soviet aircraft that we had exploited and then learned how to fly, and we flew them against American pilots to show them the capabilities of those airplanes. I actually got to do that in the 80s. We were called the Red Eagles.
In the Navy, we interacted with the Soviets all the time. So the Soviets would have these vessels that were intelligence gathering that would just steam around behind the U.S. aircraft carriers and pick up our trash. This was real. Every day in the North Atlantic, we'd have interactions with the Soviets in one form or another every day.
We spent a lot of time tracking Soviet Union weaponry, planes, as well as their anti-aircraft systems and all the other radars that they had. Because there were indicators if they moved planes to certain places at certain times, we knew that was an indicator they were about to do something big, So tracking their movements was huge.
We had this giant nuclear standoff, and there was always this fear that one side or the other would get an advantage. We got missile sites, all through Wyoming and Nebraska. We got B-52s, we got all those ready to go. But the always fear was that a surprise attack could get all those before we could even react. But no one could get our missile submarines. At that time, 41 of them. We basically went into the ocean. Even the United States didn't know where they were at. We were given blocks of ocean to hide in. And for 78 days, we stayed in these blocks of ocean. And I used to call it 4 knots to nowhere, being very, very quiet, just facing the Soviets. As horrible as a nuclear exchange would seem, if the enemy or potential enemy knows we're going to do it, there's no way in, there's no way to stop that follow-on launch. We really believed it would never happen.
We thought we were winning in the air power domain and naval domain. Army, I think, did as well, just because of quality of the force, but nobody thought it happened quite as quickly and rapidly as it did.
Certainly, at the operational or the tactical level, there was no sense that the Soviet Union was about to dissolve.
We focused an awful lot on the Berlin Wall, which was really the symbol of communism and the isolation of people. I can tell you that no one predicted that the wall would come down when it did.
We were stunned. The world's going to change. And it did.
When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Berlin Wall fell and that Iron Curtain broke loose, tens of millions of people freed us. And all those days, all those things that we did that no one knew about, my God, it was all worth it.
There was a sense of relief. There was a sense that the tensions have dropped and a sense of joy.
Our minder, or sort of escort, was an Army second lieutenant. And he said to us, would you like to go to East Berlin? And we said, can we do that? He said, nobody knows what the rules are anymore. And he had this little Volkswagen van. So we jumped in and we went through Checkpoint Charlie. And they had just stopped manning Checkpoint Charlie, both the East Germans and the Americans. So there was nobody there. The main street in East Berlin was a facade. It wasn't real. As soon as you drove behind it into the back streets, again, you're seeing those bullet holes from World War II. People riding around in 50s vintage bicycles, old cars. You come from West Berlin, you could see the contrast. The contrast should tell you that this system on the eastern side isn't going to be sustainable. And as we came back through, we began to see people starting to chip at the wall.
It was amazing. I actually have a piece of the wall that I had mounted on a board and a picture of me next to it taking a hunk of the wall right near Brandenburg Gate.
We looked into East Germany and we saw, as far as the eye could see, these little cars coming across the bridge, and you could watch them all for miles on miles.
Many people, citizens from East Germany, who were able to travel to visit with, say, family in the West for the very first time. It was astounding to see them being so awestruck by the color, the freedom, the excitement that was typical for a West German city.
It was a very special time, and I think we were all very, very excited. But at the same time, deep inside, you had kind of that little bit of a sick feeling because, a little bit of uncertainty about the Soviet Union and how all this would pan out.
We had developed ourselves and trained for the defeat of the Soviet Union. And in many ways, this was a defeat of the Soviet Union. And that collapse of the Berlin Wall separating the two Germanys was a part of that.
All the different countries went their own way. What was the United Soviet Socialist Republics was now a bunch of different countries.
It was a sense of accomplishment of many individuals over time who had the focus and the dedication to do what was right to ensure that democracy would succeed over tyranny in the Eastern Bloc countries.
The Soviet Union dissolved, and Saddam Hussein had the really magnificent bad timing to invade Kuwait right when we were at the very peak of our Cold War disciplined training.
I think Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was certainly unexpected. I don't think we really thought that he would be that aggressive to attempt to grab Kuwait with its oil riches and lay claim that this was the 19th province or whatever historic claim he made to it.
It was as if someone had really picked a fight with the wrong country. Like, do they realize what they're doing? That this is not going to be sustainable from an international standpoint.
I think the great surprise came when our president, George H.W. Bush, said this will not stand.
Now, we didn't have forces there in any large numbers. And so looking at what the threat was, if we were going to aid Kuwait, what kind of force would we need on the ground? At least on paper, Iraq had a pretty significant military.
The Iraqi army at that time was the fourth largest army in the world. So the potential was there for a very bloody, very tragic kind of battle that there could be significant losses.
And there were all kinds of predictions that this is going to be the mother of all battles.
It was a 24/7 operation to get ready to move. Everything from getting all your vehicles ready to a high state of readiness, changing from the European camouflage pattern to the sand pattern.
It was also like a boots and saddles bugle call. Everybody who could wanted to go.
It was initially called Desert Shield, and the idea was to put a tripwire in front of Saddam so he didn't try to take the eastern province of Saudi Arabia.
President H.W. Bush did not want this to become an occupation in any way. He certainly did not want to go to Baghdad and inherit Iraq.
So President Bush put together a coalition of an amazing group of nations, to include Arab nations, to evict Saddam from Kuwait.
We had very clear and limited objectives. We went to right what we believed as a country was a wrong.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
The air war started it January 17th. We had good success, the stealth technology and precision. For some people, it probably exceeded our expectations a little bit.
And so we just picked them apart. We executed the air campaign and then the 100-hour ground war.
And the drive of the Iraqis back into Iraq and out of Kuwait, I mean, it was over. It was a very quick fight.
I mean, 100 hours. What other war have we ever fought that lasted 100 hours?
And we grossly overestimated how good the Iraqis were, right? I mean, they'd been trained by the Soviets and they had Soviet aircraft, but it turned out that they were not as big and bad as we thought.
They weren't very well trained. They didn't use their weapons well. They weren't well maintained.
This great army of Iraq collapsed, essentially.
We defeated Saddam very quickly and very effectively because we were at the peak of our capability at the end of the Cold War. Saddam had a really bad sense of timing in terms of invading Kuwait.
We really studied and became experts on Soviet tactics and techniques and procedures and how they flew and capabilities of their airplanes. Those guys that flew night one on January 17th, the first time we see a MiG-23, we've already flown against it.
You could really say the first battle of that short war had been fought out there in the desert, Fort Irwin, California.
The National Training Center turned out to be a tougher environment than the actual combat.
Desert Storm showed off precision. If you remember Schwarzkopf's famous, the luckiest truck in the world, the guy that was driving across the bridge in Iraq when we did a precision-guided weapon that literally hit the bridge right where the truck was. And precision really changed the game.
Dug in Iraqi tanks, only the very top of the turret showing. And at 2,000 meters, the M1 tanks are blowing them up on the move.
Norman Schwarzkopf, he had been a Vietnam commander. He knew the things that had gone wrong. He said, I'm not gonna let that happen again. So you had the right people in leadership, you had the team effort, you had fantastic technology, and you had some great people. You bring that together, and you can't lose.
For me and my colleagues, it validated the need to be ready and to stay trained and to stay prepared.
If we would have had to fight Desert Storm right after Vietnam, it wouldn't have worked.
There was a sense of vindication that we learned from our mistakes and we corrected them. I mean, isn't that what life's all about?
It was probably one of the highlights of my career. It showed you the resilience of the American soldier. Given training and given the right people and the right leadership, you can get anything done and get it done quickly.
America won. This was a definitive win. And of course, the troops returning back home, it was a time for the country to celebrate victory.
After the Persian Gulf War, change takes place. There's this kind of love affair for veterans, a whole change from Vietnam.
One of my companies that got assigned to my brigade was made up almost entirely of Vietnam vets. When I visited them and welcomed them home, they said, we never dreamed we'd see a reception like this after what we got when we came home from Vietnam.
I think there'll always be a hole left in the hearts and souls of Vietnam vets that maybe didn't stay in like some of us did, that they never received that. They never received the appreciation of the American people for the sacrifice they made. They were judged by the decision that was made to fight that war.
A lot of the American public realized over the ensuing years after the Vietnam War how badly they felt about how the soldiers were treated. And they thought, we're not going to treat soldiers that way again. And when they get home, we're going to give them a hero's welcome. So again, the public learned, just like military leaders had learned, some valuable lessons from the experience of Vietnam.
I'm a Vietnam vet. There are a lot of Vietnam vets. I never felt I had to be vindicated. But I think what happened there, those who served in Vietnam felt that sea change. And as we did all of the welcome home ceremonies, et cetera, and you saw the Vietnam vets who in some cases were standing on the sides. You can see that.
Desert Storm, Desert Shield was a vindication for those that decided to stay in the military post-Vietnam and became the leaders in that era.
And think about those senior leaders marching with their soldiers very proudly back from the desert. They finally got their homecoming parade. They had, rather than leaving the service when we left Vietnam, they'd made the decision to stay. And when their opportunity came to meet the challenge in the desert, they were more than ready to do so.
It really showcased, I think, the work and effort of those out there who had served and all the years of service that went into building that force.
What's significant in the world is moments when an event occurs that transforms the world in some way. And I think post-Vietnam was one of those points. I think we came out of Vietnam looking at the future differently, that we aren't going to have business as usual and things need to change. So it was a reordering point for us. And so I think from that moment, certainly from everything we had done in terms of the quality of leadership, quality of troops, quality of technology, quality of thinking operationally, all those things came together.
It's a portion of our history that not enough Americans know about, but if they take the time to learn it, they'll see how absolutely critical it is to understanding who we are as Americans today and how our military got to be as well prepared and dominant as it is now.